The laughter hit the room like a wave, sudden, sharp, and completely without mercy. It rolled from the front tables toward the back of the grand ballroom, climbing the gilded walls and curling into the chandeliers above, and every person who laughed felt entirely justified in doing so, because what had just happened on that stage was, by every measure of the room's social logic, genuinely funny. Victoria Sterling, 25-year-old CEO of Sterling Holdings, one of the most closely watched executive inheritances in American business history, had just announced with perfect comedic timing and a smile that could cut glass that she was gifting a rusted, wheel-stripped, leather-rotted wreck of an automobile to a quiet man named Marcus Reed, who made his living coaxing dead machines back to life in a garage that most of these guests had never heard of and would never visit. The man stood near the back of the room in a suit that didn't quite fit the occasion, and he didn't laugh, he didn't flinch. He said two words, "Thank you." And those two words, delivered without irony or anger, somehow made the laughter louder, because a man who doesn't react the way the room expects him to react is always, to that kind of room, the funniest thing in it. No one in that ballroom, not the investors with their scotch, not the socialites with their diamonds, not the journalists angling for the photograph. No one looked at Marcus Reed that night and saw anything other than the punchline. 3 weeks later, the punchline would be worth $9 million. And the joke, it turned out, had always been on someone else entirely. Marcus Reed was 38 years old and had spent the better part of a decade becoming someone that New York City's upper echelon considered entirely beneath their notice, which suited him well enough. He ran a restoration garage called Reed and Iron out of a converted warehouse in the South Bronx, 2 lifts, a fabrication bench, a wall of hand tools, organized with a precision that would have impressed any aerospace technician, and a coffee maker that ran more or less constantly from 6 in the morning until whenever the last car was finished. He had built the place with money he'd saved over 5 years as a mechanical engineer at a mid-size aerospace firm, a job he was genuinely excellent at, and eventually left because he found corporate engineering sterile in a way he could not explain to his colleagues and never fully tried to. What he wanted, what he had always wanted, was to touch the original thing, to hold a carburetor or a connecting rod that had been machined by hand 60 years ago by a person who understood that every tolerance was a decision, and every decision was a kind of philosophy. Marcus Reed believed in objects. He believed that things made by skilled hands carry something of those hands inside them, and that restoring them was less about mechanics than it was about listening. People who knew him said he was the best diagnostician in the city. People who didn't know him looked at his neighborhood, his garage, and his skin, and assumed he fixed dents for cash. He was used to that, too. He was not poor, but he was not wealthy, and he had long since made peace with the distinction. He owned his building outright, a decision he'd made early that had cost him in the short term and rewarded him in the long. And he kept a modest apartment above the garage that smelled of motor oil and old paper and the plan/soup he made on Sunday evenings, when the week's noise finally settled down. His customers were mechanics, teachers, retired city workers, the occasional serious collector who'd heard about him through a chain of recommendations too long to trace people who cared about the machines they brought him and trusted him to care in return. He almost never turned work away on account of price. He had, on 3 separate occasions, completed restorations without charging labor because the customer was in a bad year, and the car in question was the last thing connecting them to someone they'd loved. He never mentioned these things. The people he'd helped mentioned them, sometimes to other people, and that was how his reputation grew, not through advertising or connections or the kind of strategic visibility that the business books talked about, but through the older and slower mechanism of people telling the truth about someone who deserved it. He kept one item in the top drawer of his workbench that had no mechanical purpose: a business card, cream-colored and slightly worn at the corners, embossed with the name Robert Sterling and a personal telephone number that had not been active for 2 years. Marcus had been given the card 11 years ago by a man who'd come into the garage on a Tuesday afternoon without an appointment, wearing clothes that were expensive in the way that very old money is expensive. Understated, impeccable, seemingly effortless, and asked if Marcus had time to look at an oil leak on a 1964 Bentley S3. Marcus had time. They talked for 2 hours. The man knew more about the car's history than anyone Marcus had ever met. And Marcus asked him how, and the man said he'd spent his whole life learning things that other people thought were beneath them. Marcus had never forgotten that answer. He kept the card the way some people keep photographs of conversations they don't want to lose. When Victoria Sterling appeared on the television, mounted above his parts shelf 6 weeks after her father's funeral, and said that Robert Sterling was a legend and that no one had ever understood him the way she did, Marcus looked at the card and looked at the screen and felt something move through him that he might have called grief if it had been a little simpler. It wasn't simple. It was the particular sadness of knowing that the story a person tells about someone they've lost is almost always, in the important ways, the wrong story. The charity event was held on a Thursday in October at the Carlisle Grand, a venue on the east side of Midtown that specialized in the kind of philanthropy that functions primarily as social architecture, a way for the very wealthy to be seen giving, while remaining very wealthy. Marcus received the invitation through his friend Daniel Park, a nonprofit director who ran a vocational training program on the Lower West Side and had connections to the event's organizing committee. Daniel had called him 2 days before and said, somewhat apologetically, that there was a table with an open seat and that Marcus's presence would be appreciated because the event included a segment on skilled trades education, and it would help to have someone in the room who actually knew what that meant. Marcus had said yes, partly because he respected Daniel's work, and partly because he hadn't been to anything requiring a jacket in several months, and suspected he was becoming too comfortable with his own solitude. He arrived at 7, found his table near the middle of the room, and spent the first 40 minutes listening to speeches about empowerment delivered by people whose relationship to the concept appeared entirely theoretical. The food was excellent. The champagne was better. He drank water and watched the room with the patient attention of a man accustomed to diagnosing things from the outside. He saw Victoria Sterling before she saw him. She was working the room the way people work rooms when they have been trained to do so. A smile that appeared at precisely the right moment and vanished the second it was no longer needed, handshakes that communicated confidence without warmth, a posture that held the room accountable for her comfort within it. She was striking in the way that a very sharp instrument is striking. You notice it, and then you notice that noticing it has made you careful. Marcus watched her and thought about her father, who had been none of these things, who had been loose and curious and genuinely delighted by small details, in the way that people who have survived real difficulty often are. He was thinking about this when she turned and saw him, and something crossed her face that he recognized as the specific and slightly irritated expression of someone who has placed a face but not yet decided what to do with the placement. She approached him during the cocktail reception, holding a glass of sparkling water she hadn't touched, wearing the smile again. She told him she remembered him. He'd repaired the company car of one of her mid-level operations managers last spring, wouldn't take full payment, made a point of returning it detailed, and with a note about what he'd found and fixed. She said this, the way someone names a fact that is simultaneously a compliment and a condescension. Marcus said yes. The car had a cracked motor mount that the driver hadn't noticed, but would have felt badly within another 3 months, and he'd fixed it while he had everything apart. Victoria tilted her head and said, "You still doing that? Fixing junkers for people who can barely afford them?" He said he was. She said, "That must be very fulfilling," and the word fulfilling landed in the space between them with a weight that neither of them pretended not to feel. Marcus looked at her the way he looked at engines he was about to diagnose, quietly, without judgment, gathering information, and said, "Sometimes the things other people throw away turn out to be the most valuable." The smile on her face became, very briefly, something else, something that might have been recognition, or its inverse. Then the moment passed, and someone across the room called her name, and she moved away, and Marcus finished his water and returned to his table, where Daniel was asking him if he was having a good time, and Marcus said yes, truthfully enough. The formal program began at 9. There were live auction items, a weekend in a private villa, a consulting package from a firm whose name Marcus did not recognize, a signed limited edition photograph of something, and between each lot, a presenter offered brief remarks on the cause. The energy in the room was high and loose and generously lubricated. Marcus sat through it with good humor, contributed to the live fund appeal, and was preparing to leave when Victoria Sterling returned to the stage for what the program described as a closing gesture. She stood at the podium in the way people stand at podiums when they are very sure of themselves, and she said that she had one more item to offer, something not listed in the program, something personal. She said it had belonged to her late father. She said it was a car. She paused, and in the pause, the room leaned slightly forward with the collective instinct of an audience that senses performance. Then she said that she wanted to give it to Marcus Reed, the man in the back of the room who loved a challenge, because she understood he had a passion for restoring things that other people no longer wanted. The laughter started before she finished the sentence. It built quickly. There is a specific sound that a crowd makes when it laughs at a person rather than with them, a sound with a harder edge to it, more percussive. And Marcus felt it against his skin, the way you feel a cold wind before you see the clouds that brought it. People at his table turned to look at him. Some of them were smiling with their mouths, while their eyes were doing something more uncomfortable. On the stage, Victoria was enjoying herself. She was describing the car, the rust, the cracked upholstery, the missing side mirror, the 3 flat tires, with the performative enthusiasm of a comedian working material she knows will land. And it was landing, and the room was grateful to her for making the philanthropy feel like entertainment. Marcus sat very still. He breathed evenly. He thought about nothing in particular except the grain of the tablecloth under his fingertips and the specific quality of silence that exists at the center of a loud room when you have made the decision not to be moved by it. When the laughter had reached its peak and begun its slow return to dignity, he stood, straightened his jacket, and said, clearly enough to be heard at the tables around him, "Thank you. I'll take good care of it." The laughter bent sideways into something uncertain, and Victoria Sterling, watching him from the stage, felt for the first time that evening that she was not entirely in control of what was happening. The car was delivered to Reed and Iron on a flatbed truck the following Monday morning. 3 men brought it, 2 drivers, and an assistant from Sterling Holdings Facilities Department, who handed Marcus a transfer of title and a manila envelope containing what appeared to be a very thin original documentation. Filet. The car was a 1963 vehicle, obscured so thoroughly by oxidation that its original color was indeterminate, somewhere between burgundy and gunmetal gray, underneath the decades of rust and neglect. The tires were not merely flat, but split. The windshield had a diagonal crack across the lower third. The interior had been consumed by something, biological mold or rot or both, that had reduced the original seat material to a gray paste in the corners. It smelled of old water and time. The drivers were watching Marcus with the slightly guilty expressions of people who have been asked to participate in something they suspect is unkind. He thanked them, signed the title, and walked around the car once without speaking. They left. He stood there alone in the morning light coming through the garage's high windows, and he did not feel humiliated or defeated or any of the things that Victoria Sterling had presumably intended him to feel. He felt curious. He felt the particular electricity of a puzzle presenting itself, the gathering of attention in his hands and behind his eyes that always preceded his best work. He pulled on his gloves and opened the driver's door and began. He worked methodically, the way he always worked, beginning at the exterior and moving inward in layers: surface condition, structural integrity, mechanical systems, electrical systems, identification. The surface was what everyone had seen, catastrophic. But surfaces were, in Marcus's professional estimation, almost always the least interesting part of any car. Surface damage was visible, and visible damage was, by definition, known damage. It was the invisible damage, the hairline cracks, the hidden corrosion, the compromised tolerances, the things you could only find by touching and listening and measuring, that told you what you were actually dealing with. He began with a wire brush and a flashlight, clearing the worst of the oxidation from the body panels, And within the first 2 hours, he had noticed three things that stopped him mid-motion and made him set down his tools and look more carefully. The first was the body construction itself, the way the panels met at their seams, the radius of the wheel arches, the proportion of the greenhouse to the body. The second was the hood, which was longer than it should have been for any standard production model of this era that matched the car's general profile. The third, the one that made him go to his workbench and find a flashlight and a magnifying glass and crouch on the concrete floor for 10 full minutes, was the data plate mounted to the driver's door jamb, which bore a vehicle identification number that did not match any production run he could place in any manufacturer's catalog, from any country, from any decade. He called Daniel that evening and described what he'd found. Daniel listened carefully and then said, slowly, "Marcus, what are you actually saying?" Marcus said he wasn't sure yet. He said he needed to make some calls. He said he was going to spend a few more days with the car before he talked to anyone else. He said, and this was the part that would stay with Daniel for years afterward, "The man who gave this car away left me something in here. I just haven't found all of it yet." He was looking, while he said this, at the business card in the top drawer of his workbench. Robert Sterling had told him, 11 years ago, to never sell a car without knowing what it was first. The specific, almost conspiratorial precision of that advice, given to a young mechanic in a small garage in the South Bronx by a billionaire who had come in without an appointment, had been strange enough at the time to lodge itself permanently in Marcus's memory. He was beginning to understand that it had not been coincidental. Over the following days, Marcus's investigation deepened in the way that genuine discoveries deepen not in a straight line, but in spirals, each new piece of information creating a new perimeter of questions. He pulled the engine, which was a task requiring 2 hours and the careful choreography of chains and hoists, and found beneath the accumulated grime a power plant that did not belong to any production vehicle he could identify. The block casting was hand-finished. The cylinder heads bore machining marks that were inconsistent with any automated tooling process, and entirely consistent with skilled manual work performed by someone who regarded precision as a moral obligation. The carburation system was a custom assembly, using components from at least 3 different manufacturers, blended with hand-fabricated linkage that had been engineered to a specification that existed nowhere in any catalog Marcus had ever seen. He photographed everything. He sent the photographs to 3 specialists, one in Germany, one in California, one in upstate New York, with no context beyond the images themselves, and a request for any identification they could offer. The responses came back within 48 hours, and each one said, in different language and with varying degrees of certainty, the same thing. This was not a production vehicle. This was a prototype, something one of a kind, built by hand, for a specific purpose or patron, at a time when such things were occasionally commissioned by people of extraordinary wealth and even more extraordinary taste. The California specialist, who had spent 30 years authenticating vehicles for auction houses, said in his email that if the identification held up, he would need to see the car in person. He said he would fly in at his own expense. The secret compartment was found on a Wednesday afternoon by accident, in the way that the most important discoveries are often found by accident, which is to say, not by accident at all, but by the application of such sustained and thorough attention that the thing being hidden eventually runs out of room to hide. Marcus was working on the interior frame, removing corroded structural members for assessment, when his pry bar caught a seam behind the rear seat bolster that should not have been there. He stopped. He ran his fingers along it. He applied a small, precise amount of pressure. A panel pivoted inward on a spring mechanism that had been machined to such tight tolerances that it had held its seal against moisture and time and decay for decades. Behind it was a shallow cavity, lined in leather that had been treated with something that had preserved it against the environment, and inside the cavity was a single item, a cream-colored envelope sealed with wax, addressed in a handwriting that Marcus recognized immediately from the signature on the business card in his workbench drawer. The address on the envelope read, in that same careful hand, "For the person who finds the real value in this." He set it on his workbench, and looked at it for a long time before opening it. He made himself a cup of coffee. He stood at the garage's side door for a few minutes, looking out at the street, watching a delivery truck navigate around a double-parked sedan, watching two kids on the corner argue about something that dissolved into laughter. Then he came back to the bench, sat down on his stool, and carefully broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter inside. It was 3 pages, handwritten on heavy paper, in the same precise handwriting as the envelope. Robert Sterling had written it. The date at the top indicated he'd written it approximately 14 months before his death, and it began not with explanation or instruction, but with a story. He wrote about growing up in rural Georgia in the 1950s, in a family that had nothing and was treated accordingly not by strangers only, but by systems, by institutions, by the accumulated weight of a society that had decided, long before he was born, what his life was worth and what it would be permitted to become. He wrote about leaving at 17 with $40 and a determination that he described, with characteristic precision, not as ambition, but as refusal to be what the circumstances specified. He wrote about the years of labor and learning, the doors he'd had to construct himself because none of the existing ones were open to him, the mentors who had appeared at critical moments, usually older men, usually black, usually working in trades or crafts that the mainstream world hadn't thought to gatekeep because it hadn't thought enough of them to bother. He wrote about a mechanic in Memphis named Charles who had spent 2 weeks teaching a young Robert Sterling how to listen to an engine the way you would listen to a person in pain, with patience, without assumption, with the understanding that the thing telling you what's wrong is almost always also the thing best equipped to tell you what it needs. The middle section of the letter was harder to read. Robert Sterling wrote about wealth and what it had done to his ability to see clearly. He did not write about this with self-pity or fashionable guilt. He wrote about it with the forensic honesty of someone conducting an autopsy on a living patient and finding, not without horror, that the patient is themselves. He described watching his daughter grow from a child who had inherited his curiosity and his stubbornness into an executive who had learned to use those qualities as weapons rather than tools. He wrote that he had watched Victoria Sterling become, in ways he took personal responsibility for, a person who measured others primarily by what they cost and what they returned. He wrote that he had tried and failed to correct this, because the corrections he had offered, example, conversation, deliberate exposure to people outside her social architecture, had been insufficient against the environment he himself had built around her. He wrote, with a directness that Marcus found both devastating and admirable, I gave her the world I built, and in doing so, I may have taken from her the capacity to understand why I built it. He wrote that if she had given this car to someone as a joke, as a public humiliation, as evidence of a hierarchy she believed in and wanted to reinforce, then she had not yet become the person who could lead what he had spent his life constructing. And then, in the final paragraph of the second page, he wrote, but I believe she can become that person. I believe she is closer to it than she knows. What she needs is not another lecture from me. What she needs is the mirror. The third page was addressed, with a shift in tone that Marcus felt physically in his chest, directly to whoever was reading. Robert Sterling wrote that the car had been commissioned in 1961 by a European industrialist who had wanted something that no one else in the world had. It had been built by a small workshop in northern Italy, 4 craftsmen over 18 months, and had changed hands 3 times before Sterling acquired it in the early 1990s, at an estate sale where no one present had known what they were looking at. He had known. He had known because Charles, the Memphis mechanic, had described a car exactly like it to a teenage Robert Sterling in a garage 40 years earlier, as an example of what the highest level of the craft could produce when money was no obstacle and pride was the only specification. He had spent 30 years looking for it. He had found it 3 months after his daughter's 21st birthday. He had kept it, and kept it secret, and eventually decided that the most valuable thing he could do with it was entrust it to someone who would understand not just what it was worth, but what it meant. He wrote, I don't know who you are, but I know how you found this letter, which means I know the kind of person you are. The car is yours. Do with it what your conscience and your character require. That is all I have ever asked of anyone." Marcus sat with the letter for a long time after finishing it. The garage was quiet around him. The car sat on its lift, partially dismantled, its secrets extracted and laid out on the bench beside him. He thought about the man who had walked into this same space 11 years ago and talked with him for 2 hours about the history of a Bentley and the philosophy of restoration. He thought about the specific weight of having been trusted by someone who was no longer alive to know whether the trust had been warranted. He thought about Victoria Sterling, who had stood on a stage and used her father's last possession to purchase a few minutes of laughter from people who would not remember it by morning. He thought about the fact that she almost certainly did not know what she had given away, and then he thought about the fact that her father had known she might do exactly this and had built the test accordingly. He folded the letter carefully along its original creases and placed it in the envelope and set the envelope in the top drawer of his workbench beside the business card. The California specialist arrived 2 days later in a rented car, carrying a briefcase of documentation tools and the barely suppressed energy of a person who suspects they are about to see something extraordinary. His name was Gerald Hawthorne, and he had authenticated some of the most significant vehicle discoveries of the past 3 decades. And within 45 minutes of examining the car, he sat down on a stool in the middle of Marcus's garage and put his face in his hands and stayed that way for nearly a minute. When he looked up, he said, "Do you understand what this is?" Marcus said he had some idea. Gerald said, "No, I don't think you do." He then spent the next 2 hours explaining, in the patient and slightly frenzied manner of someone conducting a tour of a cathedral they have spent their life believing was a legend, exactly what Marcus was holding. The car was a unique pre-production prototype, built in 1962 by a 4-person workshop in Turin for a private commission that had been, as far as any documented evidence indicated, never completed. The commissioning party had died before delivery, the workshop had been dissolved shortly afterward, and the car had vanished from any traceable record for decades. There were 2 photographs of it in existence, both black and white, both taken during the build process by one of the craftsmen. Gerald had copies of those photographs in his briefcase, had been carrying them for 20 years, and had not until this morning believed the car itself still existed. He said conservative auction estimates would begin at $9 million. He said the actual sale price in the current market, with proper provenance documentation and the right promotional context, could exceed 15. He said he would like to begin the authentication process immediately if Marcus was willing. Marcus said he was, and offered him coffee, and Gerald said yes, and stared at the car the way people stare at things they are afraid to stop looking at in case they disappear. The news broke the following week, and it broke in the particular way that stories break in the modern era everywhere and instantly, and with an enthusiastic disregard for nuance. The headline, in various forms, appeared in automotive publications, in business media, in general interest outlets, in places that had never previously covered either classic car authentication or the social dynamics of charity events. Man given rusted car, as joke discovers, it's worth $9 million. Victoria Sterling's name appeared in every version. The story reconstructed the charity event in granular detail. The speech, the laughter, the crowd, the 2 words Marcus had said, and set it against the discovery, with the narrative satisfaction of a story that appears to have written itself. The coverage was not kind to Victoria. Her public image, which had been carefully constructed around the dual narratives of young executive brilliance and devoted daughter's legacy, bent badly under the weight of context. Her board of directors began receiving calls from institutional investors. Several longtime Sterling Holdings partners sent carefully worded emails through their representatives, suggesting that the association with the story was creating what they described, in the diplomatic language of people who mean something much harsher, as a challenging optics environment. Victoria's communications team released a statement emphasizing her father's charitable legacy and her ongoing commitment to inclusive business practices, and the statement was received with the specific public skepticism that greets any statement that appears to have been written by lawyers in response to a disaster rather than by a human being in response to a feeling. Victoria Sterling read the coverage alone in her office on a Saturday morning, without her communications director or her legal counsel or any of the other people who usually stood between her and information that required managing. She read everything. She read the reconstructions of the event. She read the expert commentary on the car's historical significance. She read the profile pieces that had been written about Marcus Reed, 3 of them, appearing in publications that ranged from an automotive journal to a national news magazine, and she read them carefully, in the way you read something, when you are trying to understand how the person being written about could possibly be a real and fully formed human being, when your existing mental filing system had organized them as something considerably smaller. She read about his engineering background and his decision to leave it. She read about the free restorations and the customers he'd carried. She read about the workspace above the garage and the Sunday soup and the way he organized his tools. She sat with the recognition that she had looked at this person, this specific and serious and deeply competent person, and seen nothing more than an opportunity for a cheap joke. The recognition did not feel like a revelation. It felt like looking at a photograph of yourself at a moment you cannot take back and understanding, with complete and sickening clarity, exactly how you appeared to everyone who was watching. She called Marcus that same afternoon. He did not answer. She called again the following morning. He did not answer. She sent a message through Daniel Park, who called Marcus and said, without editorial comment, that Victoria Sterling would like to meet with him. Marcus told Daniel that he needed more time. Daniel relayed this without editorial comment. Victoria, who was accustomed to a world in which her requests were accommodated quickly by people who had reasons to accommodate them, found the experience of being made to wait by someone who had no particular motivation to hurry unusual enough to be instructive. She had plenty of time, in the waiting, to consider what she was actually planning to say. She came to the garage on a Tuesday morning, unannounced except for a text sent 15 minutes earlier that Marcus did not respond to, but did not ignore. She drove herself a fact that the 2 journalists stationed outside the building, who had been watching the property since the story broke, photographed with the careful attention of people who understand that the removal of attendance is itself the story. She wore a coat that Marcus recognized as expensive in the way his own suit had not been expensive, and she walked through the open garage door with a posture that was different from the one she'd worn at the charity event. Not diminished exactly, but restructured, the architecture of it rearranged around a different intention. Marcus was at his bench, working on a set of valve covers from a separate job. He did not put them down immediately. He let her stand in the middle of his garage for a moment, not as a power move, but because he was at a precise point in the work, and the work had its own requirements. When he finished, he set the valve covers down, wiped his hands, turned around, and waited. Victoria said she was sorry. She said it without preamble or qualification, and then she said it again, and then she stopped. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. He said, "Are you apologizing for disrespecting me, or because the car was worth $9 million?" The question landed in the space between them like a stone dropped in still water, and the rings from it went outward, and Victoria Sterling stood in the center of them and could not pretend she didn't feel them. She said carefully, "Both, and I understand that makes the first one worth less." Marcus said nothing for a moment. Then he picked up the envelope from the bench he had left it there that morning deliberately, though he could not have said entirely why, and handed it to her. She looked at it. She recognized her father's handwriting on the envelope, and something in her face changed in the way that faces change when a person encounters a thing they have not prepared for, not a collapse, but a yielding, a sudden absence of the architecture that had been holding the expression in place. She looked at Marcus. He said, "Your father left it in the car. It was meant for whoever found it." She said, "You read it?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Is it bad?" Marcus said, "It's honest," which isn't the same thing. She opened the envelope. She read standing up, in the middle of the garage, with motor oil smell, and the distant sound of the street, and the light coming through the high windows. And Marcus went to the coffee maker and poured 2 cups and set them on the bench and did not watch her. Because the thing she was doing was private, and he had already had his own version of it, and he understood what it cost. He heard her cry before he turned around. It was not a dramatic crying. It was the specific, reluctant crying of a person who has spent a long time not crying and has finally met something their defenses were not built to hold. She folded the letter with care, as if already aware that it was something she would need to keep, and she pressed it against her chest for a moment with both hands, and then she set it on the bench beside the coffee cup Marcus had poured for her and picked up the cup and held it without drinking. Marcus said nothing. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It had the quality of a silence that earns itself two people on opposite sides of a serious thing, sitting with what they actually know about it. After a while, Victoria said quietly, "He never told me any of this. Any of it. The Georgia part, the Charles part. He talked about his early life, like it was just background, not—" She stopped. Marcus said, "He probably didn't know how to tell you without it sounding like a lecture." She said, "It doesn't sound like a lecture." He said, "No, it sounds like the most important conversation he never had with you." She looked at him. She said, "You're not going to make this easy, are you?" He said, "Easy wouldn't help either of us." She almost smiled. It was the first unperformed expression Marcus had seen on her face, and it changed her completely. In the weeks that followed, the auction process moved forward through Gerald Hawthorne's authentication firm, and the international collector community received the news of the car's existence with the restrained but unmistakable intensity of people who have just been told that a painting they believed was lost has been found rolled up in a farmhouse. There were inquiries from museum collections in 4 countries, from private collectors on 3 continents, from automotive heritage institutions that Marcus had not previously known existed. Offers arrived, not yet formal, but substantive enough to confirm Gerald's estimate. A European collector's representative flew in to inspect the vehicle in person and made a preliminary bid that would have, by any reasonable measure, represented a life-changing sum. Marcus received each inquiry politely and said he was still deciding. His staff, now 2 part-time employees who had come on to help manage the volume of work that the media attention had, somewhat inconveniently, generated, asked him what he was waiting for. He said he wasn't waiting. He said he was thinking. They said those sounded like the same thing. He said not always. The announcement Marcus made was not through any media intermediary or official release. He called Gerald Hawthorne and the representatives of the most serious institutional inquiry, a mechanical arts museum in Chicago, that had been requesting a conversation for several weeks, and he told them what he had decided. The car would not be sold. It would be placed on permanent loan to the museum, under a stewardship agreement that would cover its ongoing preservation and allow public viewing. The financial arrangement attached to the loan, which took some negotiation but arrived eventually at a structure all parties accepted, would direct a substantial annual endowment to a vocational training program, one that Marcus would design, in collaboration with Daniel Park's organization, for young people in low-income neighborhoods who wanted to learn precision trades. The car would be exhibited under a title that Marcus specified, which was the same 4 words that had been written on the envelope: "For the person who finds the real value." The authentication documents would be displayed alongside the car. The letter would not be displayed. It would remain in the top drawer of his workbench at Reed and Iron. Victoria Sterling attended the private ceremony at the museum on a November afternoon, standing near the back of a room that included Gerald Hawthorne, Daniel Park, 3 members of the museum's board, and a journalist from the Automotive Journal, who had been given exclusive access on the condition that she write the story accurately and not sentimentally. Marcus spoke briefly. He was not a natural public speaker, but he was a natural, honest speaker, which turned out to be better, and said that the car had been built by 4 people in a workshop in Turin more than 60 years ago, and that those 4 people had made something of such singular quality that it had outlasted everyone who originally knew it existed, and that he thought that was the truest thing he could say about what craft, done with full seriousness, was capable of. He said that the person who had kept the car and hidden the letter had understood something that he hoped more people would come to understand, which was that the value of a thing is not determined by what the room is willing to pay for it on any given evening. He looked at the car for a moment, under the museum's careful light, clean now, restored to a condition that was not its original perfection, but was perhaps something better. Its genuine history made visible, its real age worn honestly, its improbable survival acknowledged. Then he looked up at the room and said that he was grateful, and he meant all of it. A year passed. Marcus's garage continued to operate in the way it had always operated, with the difference that the phone rang more now, and the clientele had broadened to include people from farther away who had heard the story and wanted, for reasons ranging from the entirely practical to the entirely sentimental, to have their cars touched by the hands that had found the thing no one else had seen. He did not change his prices significantly. He did not relocate. He hired one additional full-time restorer, a 24-year-old from the Bronx named James who had grown up 2 miles from the garage and had dropped out of an engineering program for reasons that, when Marcus heard them, reminded him with uncomfortable precision of himself at the same age. The vocational program launched in February with 11 students and a waiting list. Marcus taught the first class himself on a Tuesday morning, wearing the same work clothes he'd worn the day the car arrived. He talked about listening. Victoria Sterling's public year was harder. The narrative that had attached itself to her name was not easily detached, and she did not attempt to detach it through counter-narrative or strategic repositioning, which surprised the people whose job it was to expect those things from her. Instead, she did something that her communications director described, in a moment of genuine bewilderment, as completely off-script. She started changing things. The changes were not dramatic or announced. They were structural. She revised the criteria by which Sterling Holdings evaluated its supplier relationships to include a weighted metric for labor practices. She created a direct channel from operations-level employees to the executive office that bypassed middle management and actually responded to submissions. She spent one Tuesday afternoon a month at a different company site, without advance notice and just to site management, having lunch with the people who worked there, and she asked them questions, and she listened to the answers, and she made notes in a small notebook that she kept in her coat pocket. Her board found this difficult to quantify, and therefore difficult to assess. But the people who worked for Sterling Holdings found it surprisingly easy to quantify. They were being treated as though they were worth something. And the assessments that came back through the employee channels, which had previously returned numbers in a range that the HR team described as mediocre, began returning numbers in a range they did not have a word for because they had not previously needed one. She came to the garage in late October, 1 year, almost to the day after the charity event. She did not call ahead. She parked on the street and walked through the open door the way she had walked through it the first time, except that this time, the posture had settled into something that was neither the polished armor of the stage nor the stripped-down vulnerability of the day she'd read her father's letter, but something that felt to Marcus, watching her come in, like the genuine version, the architecture a person develops when they have started building themselves instead of performing themselves. James looked up from the carburetor he was cleaning, and Marcus said, "Keep going," and James kept going, and Victoria came to stand in the middle of the garage where she'd stood before, and Marcus set down the fitting he was working with and turned to face her. She looked around the garage. She looked at James. She looked at the shelf of tools, and the coffee maker, and the Bentley on the left lift, and the newer project on the right. She looked at the corner where the car had sat on its flatbed that October morning, which was now empty except for a clean floor. She said, "How's the program?" He said it was going well. He said James was actually one of the first students, which James, from across the garage, received with a small nod and no other visible reaction but a slight precision in his work that suggested he'd heard. She said she was glad. Then she said, "My father left the car to you. He didn't do it by accident. He didn't do it because he knew the value." She paused. "He did it because he knew you." Marcus waited. She said, "He left me a letter that told me who he really was. I think that was the same instinct. He gave you what you could use. He gave me what I needed." Marcus said, "He gave you a chance." She said, "Yes." She looked at him steadily. She said, "A chance to become a better person. He just couldn't tell me which direction to walk in." She paused again. "I think he was hoping I'd figure that out on my own." Marcus said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "And did you?" The question was not a challenge. It was, in the specific and careful register that the two of them had developed over the course of a year's worth of occasional and honest conversations, something closer to an offering. She said, "I'm still working on it, but I think I'm walking in the right direction." She paused one more time, and something in her eyes held the particular quality of a person about to say the true thing they have been carrying. She said, "My father left me the letter. He left you the car. But I think what he was actually leaving both of us was a chance to figure out how to be the kind of people who deserve each other's company." Marcus looked at her. He looked at the space where the car had been. He looked at the work around him, the tools, the lifts, the two men working on machines that would, in the hands of careful people, outlast everyone in this room. He said, "Then I guess we keep working." She smiled. Not the stage smile, not the yielded smile, but the real one. The one that had been there underneath the architecture all along. The one that her father had probably seen in her when she was a child, and had spent the rest of his life believing he would see again. It was the right smile for the right moment, in a garage that smelled of oil and coffee and the specific and irreplaceable dignity of work done honestly. Two people stood in a garage in the South Bronx, and between them was the space where something valuable had once sat. Something that the world had looked at and seen only ruin, and one man had looked at and seen a question worth answering. The car was gone now, held in trust in a museum in Chicago, lit by careful lights, visited by people who came to see what it was, and stayed sometimes to think about what it meant. The letter was still in the drawer. The business card was still beside it. And outside the garage, the city moved in its perpetual and indifferent way, full of things that had been thrown away and things that had not yet been found, and the immeasurable distance between those two categories, a distance that is crossed when it is crossed, not by luck, or by markets, or by the opinions of rooms full of people who have decided, in advance, what something is worth, but by the patient and unglamorous and absolutely necessary work of a person who knows how to listen